Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and really thank you for taking the time to be with us this afternoon as we get into part 2 of our Bible class today as we continue to focus on Revelation chapter 13. All right, so welcome everyone. Let's bow our heads for prayer. Father, we come before you. We thank you for spared life. We thank you for the opportunity to study your word. We believe that you have a lot to tell us through your word, dear Lord, and really we are excited to study your word and to understand the truths that are landed inside your words, that as we discover them, dear Lord, we will indeed be drawn closer to you. Help us to really see Christ in all that we study, and may you draw us ever closer to you. Be with everyone who is here today, and those who will join a little bit later. We pray that you would bless us all individually, collectively, in our families, and continue to use us for thy name, praise, honor, and glory is our prayer in Jesus' most holy name. Amen. All right, so welcome everyone. And as we said, we want to get into part 2 of the lesson we started last week. And so we get straight into it. Thank you all for joining. And in particular, I say hello and thanks to our regulars. I see you all, and I'm really happy that you are here. And we will then again try to move through the material as quickly as we can. So today we want to get back into covering some of the material we did last week. You know, our approach has been to use each lesson that we do as a means of recapping where we are. A lot of you have come back to me and said that you have a preference for the review because it helps you to reinforce some of the things that we covered previously, and so we'll continue with that. I know one or two of you said you just want to get on to the other aspect of the study because you are so anxious to move from one to the next. So we try to find a middle ground and see how much we can cover. So today I just want to put Revelation chapter 13 in the context of the book of Revelation. I want to spend some time just reminding you of the historical sequence of Christianity from Daniel's time down to John's time to when Christ will come a second time. I thought it important, given where we are heading, to just remind you about Revelation chapter 2 and 3 that talks about the 7 churches. To a large extent, the 7 churches has the same value in terms of our prophetic interpretation as Daniel chapter 2 did when we studied Daniel. When we did Daniel chapter 2 gave us a very brief summary of the kingdoms that will come after Babylon, and eventually Christ will come and set up his kingdom. And that overview, if you will, that overview of the kingdoms and the succession of kingdoms, etc., became our basis for when we studied Daniel chapter 7, chapter 8, and chapter 9, and then later on 10, 11, and 12, because the detail that they got into were really details that were related to the broad outline that we saw in Daniel chapter 2. I want to suggest to you that to a large extent, the messages to the 7 churches in Revelation plays a similar role as we study the book of Revelation. And a lot of times we are quick to dismiss the 7 churches because it doesn't sound as exciting as the rest of the book. But as we did when we studied those chapters 2 and 3 of Revelation, and we looked into the 7 churches, there are some details in there that are extremely important that help us make sense, if you will, of some of the other things that we study, particularly in Revelation chapter 13, which is where we are putting in our focus today. I have a similar value, if you will, around Revelation chapter 12, so that while Revelation chapter 2 gives us a synopsis of all the prophetic journeys of the Christian church, Revelation chapter 12 gives us a very good overview and summary of the great controversy between Christ and Satan, between God and Lucifer, that really puts a very good context and background against all that we are studying and all the specific things. So we will spend a little bit of time just covering the main points that we did there. And I want to introduce the story of Elijah that is really landed in its climax in 1 Kings chapter 18. I want to talk a little bit about that today. So we'll talk about that. And then we'll get into Revelation chapter 13 itself. Not a lot here. We'll talk a little bit of review about the sea beast that we studied last week and some of the conclusions that we draw upon. And we talked about the fact that the sea beast seems to have a vicarious relationship with the dragon. And we'll talk about what sort of substitute is happening between the dragon and the sea beast. And then we'll plunge into the beast from the land, which is the second beast. And we'll talk a little bit about its identity. And then next week we'll continue with its activities. All right. So you have a sense of how we are approaching this week's session. So in outlining the book of Revelation, I thought I will just remind you again this beautiful quote that comes from Ellen White in the book Acts of the Apostles. She said, "In figures and symbols, subjects of vast importance were presented to John." So it's again important to remember that while we are using a lot of symbolism in the book of Revelation, we are presenting significant historical truths and theological truths, all right? And then we are making some very strong and very definitive inferences and conclusions about what is likely to happen in the years ahead leading up to when Christ comes the second time. So I want to just repeat that. In figures and symbols, which are the symbolic metaphorical language that we find within the book of Revelation, we are gleaning from that. We are coming to very clear conclusions around historical facts. So we will find that there is and we're in a very good place as 21st century Christians, because we can look back, if you will, on the historical events and see how much they align to what is written in the book of Revelation. John in his time did not have that luxury, because a lot of what he recorded in the book of Revelation, the metaphors and the symbols related to stuff that will happen in the future. And therefore for John it was very confusing. But for us 21st century Christians, it is not so confusing, because we can make conclusions based on our survey of the historical facts as they took place and are well recorded outside of even the Bible, so that we begin to appreciate that what the messages John received are aligned to historical facts. We will also find that the symbols that we see around lamb and sacrifice and dragon and the remnant of a seed, etc., and all the various things that will come, they are giving us very clear theological truths and conclusions that we can agree to. All right, so we are learning historical facts, we are arriving at theological conclusions, and then more importantly, we are receiving information that gives us very good guidance to form conclusions about what the future events are likely to look at, and to have a lot of confidence around the expected events, because of the fact that we are beginning from a place where we have seen the historical realization of what is written in Revelation. And because what happened historically is aligned to what we saw in Revelation, we are confident in drawing conclusions around future events. I want you to appreciate that very, very important point. So that is the real value of the historicist approach to interpreting the book of Revelation, and indeed interpreting the book of Daniel, because the historism and the historicist approach basically says that some of the book was already fulfilled, some is being fulfilled, and some will be fulfilled. And basically it seeks to make sense, if you will, of events that will occur within the world and indeed the spiritual realm related to the time of the prophet to the time when Christ comes. All right, so So that is extremely important. And it's in that context that we arrived at this framework, if you will, for looking at Revelation by suggesting that there is a historical half that goes up to chapter 11 and to some extent chapter 14, which is where we are today. And then we're in that section, if you will. And then there is an eschatological half that speaks to end time event. Eschatology is the study of end time events as they occur. And so as we move into chapters 15 to 22, we will be focusing on end time events, future events. And we are going to be making reasonable conclusions around the way those events will unfold because of the principles we are using in interpreting the historical half of the book. Everybody's okay with that? So those principles are what are making us draw the conclusions. And therefore, if you hear different conclusions from other authors and other practitioners and other theologians, the question is not to argue about who is right or wrong. It is more to understand what are the principles, what are the tools, what are the keys to interpretation that are being used. Clearly, if a presenter is using a futurist approach as opposed to a historicist approach, then everything they read in Revelation assumes will happen somewhere in the future. And if they were using a preterism approach, they will assume that everything they saw in Revelation is happening in the past and has no relevance to our time. So that you begin to appreciate that the historicist approach is our anchor in interpretation. And I want you to remember that we did not choose historism arbitrarily, but we followed the prophecy of Daniel, which was very much a historicist approach. So that when Nebuchadnezzar received the dream of the metallic man with the head of gold, when the vision was clarified to Daniel, and Daniel went before Nebuchadnezzar, he said, "You are the head of gold." In other words, you represent a current period, and then things will happen thereafter. And Daniel is one of those books where we are not guessing the prophetic interpretation, because the interpretation of the various visions were given in the book, and it followed a historicist approach. So having said that, we are in good company, if you will, to establish why historism is our preferred approach. And I told you before that historically, people like Isaac Newton and Galileo and some of the others who study the Bible, and we don't normally think of those scientists as being biblical preachers, but they were. And when they reviewed the Bible, they too adopted a historicist approach. And it wasn't until the Middle Ages, in the Dark Ages period, when the church realized that the historicist interpretation basically condemned their actions, their current actions, in the persecution of the saints, etc., that the Jesuit leaders of the church were tasked, if you will, to come up with an alternative interpretations. And it is there we have the genesis of a lot of futurism that is now crept into the interpretation of Revelation. So we are at the point where we are transitioning, if you will, from the very repetitive history of the Christian church that we saw in the 7 churches, the 7 seals and the 7 trumpets. And we are making the transition, if you will, to a heavy focus on end time future events. And to do that, we are locked, if you will, within this pivot point here that speaks to the great controversy that it occurred in heaven and why it occurred, gives an overview of the great controversy, and now talks about supporting earthly kingdoms and empires that will be used by the dragon and when we say that word dragon in this sense, we mean the devil, Lucifer, in carrying out his great controversy against Jesus Christ. All right, so that is fundamentally where we are at this point in time. So we've concluded the Revelation outline and understand where we are. Now, from a historical perspective, I went back to our number line that we used before, where we attempted to use a scale model to represent 1,000 years BC, and then show a little bit over 2,000 years AD, which is the current period that we are in, right? But of course, this is meant to show even more than that. Now, by the way, when I use this number line, I am not into dating and predicting when Christ would come. A lot of people use number lines and they say you could predict the exact time when Christ would come, and he would come in 2020 or he'd come in whatever. A lot of those dates have gone and fall by the wayside, and I hold strong to Jesus's counsel in Matthew 24 when he says, "Watch therefore, for you know not the day nor the hour when the Son of Man cometh." But he then went on to say that you know when he has come, when you see him burst the clouds of glory. And then he says, you know it is harvest time when you see the, and that is my synopsis of what he said. You know it's harvest time when you see the fields and you realize that the flowers are blooming, all right? So basically Jesus is saying you can certainly glean from the general scheme of world events that his coming is close, but to land on specific dates and times is really not our focus. Interestingly, William Miller and his colleagues who were part of the Advent movement in the 1840s, they missed that little bit of counsel from Jesus Christ. And they were so overjoyed that they had found a date, October 22nd, 1844, that overpowered and overshadowed everything. So as we do the number line, I'm just simply using historical accounts to land some of the major events, activities that we have covered already in the book of Daniel and to a large extent in the book of Revelation as well. So we knew that Nebuchadnezzar basically came into power and established Babylon as a powerful world nation in the Middle East, displacing the Assyrians who were before him, who of course had displaced the Egyptians who were before them, and all the early civilizations. So by 605 BC, Babylon was the main power, the main force, the world force, if you will. They were the ones who had real cosmic control of the universe and the earth. And Nebuchadnezzar was their king, all right? Of course, he was seen as the head of gold and the lion. And then around 539, led by the very visionary and dynamic leader called Cyrus, the Medes and the Persians overtook Babylon through Belshazzar's follies that remember we studied in Daniel chapter 5 and the writing on the wall, mini tekel of fasting. You've been weighed in the balances and found wanted. And in that regard, the Medes and the Persians then became, again, this is historical fact, around 539 BC, we had the fall of Babylon and the establishment of the Medo-Persian Empire, an empire that made up of Medes and Persians, a people's partnership, I like to call it. But you know very well that eventually the Persians became the more dominant leaders. And it is in there we found the Ahasuerus and stuff who featured in the book of Esther. They would be later subdued, if you will. It is a place in the Middle East around the Fertile Crescent, Mesopotamia, in the area around the Tigris and the Euphrates River, which is today modern-day Iraq. It is in that area, if you will, and indeed stretching towards the Mediterranean Sea to the west, if you will, and Turkey to the east. It is in that area, if you will, that most of civilization is concentrated, and it is where most of the biblical theater of action takes place, all right? So this is a place with a lot of people, a lot of strife, a lot of fighting back and forth, if you will. There is no United Nations, there is no television to say, well, you could live in your own place. People became prominent by becoming conquerors. And invariably, the Greeks followed next, and under their very young and very wise leader, Alexander the Great, who died at age 32, they conquered the Persians, who were now a diminishing kingdom, and eventually the Greeks were followed by the Romans. The Romans were a civilization. And by the way, I've said to you before when we were doing Daniel that we need to be very careful because while I am representing these nations on paper in a two-dimensional way, this is real history we are talking about. And history is not cut and dry. It isn't like a play where it's being managed by a stage manager where in 168 BC, somebody comes and say, Rome, your time now. No, no, no. What we have happening is that there is a lot of overlap. Even as Babylon was in existence pre-605 BC, Rome was also in existence, but they were not a prominent world power at that time. And so they went through their own metamorphosis, their own changes along the way, if you will. But by 168, we had the coming together, if you will, of Julius Caesar and the dramas that are associated with the Roman Republic. And they were stretching themselves and becoming conquerors. And they started to conquer what is known as the Mediterranean basin. So a lot of the nations around the Mediterranean Sea, which is where today modern Western Europe is situated, they were all at the time, if you will, part of the Roman Empire, all right? So the Romans are the ones who are in domination by the time Christ is born. And so by AD 31, when Jesus is crucified, the Romans are the ones who have put Christ to death using their crucifixion method. We noted that a few years after Christ's death, the Jews eventually stoned Stephen, who was considered to be one of the deacons and young apostles who came up to help the Peter and the others in carrying forward the message. And it is in the manner in which Stephen was stoned in that they basically said to the Romans that he too was basically blasphemous and he was speaking against their rules because Stephen was making a very powerful argument that Jesus is the Messiah and he's the one they crucified. So the Jews couldn't handle that. And in their condemnation, if you will, of Stephen, they physically stoned him to death. And we know that one of the Jews who witnessed that and who silently may have turned them on was a fellow called Saul, who would later be converted by Jesus Christ. What a powerful God we serve. And he became Paul, and he wrote extensively to the work of Christianity and carried the gospel to all parts of the earth, all right? And then around AD 70, Jerusalem was destroyed. So between these two events, we are seeing the coming to the end, if you will, of the Jewish influence. The Jews are scattered. They're all over the various places. They don't have a home at that point in time. And the Romans have become really the dominant factor. So by AD 100, Christianity is spread extensively throughout Rome. They are using Pax Romana, which is really the Roman peace, a period of peace that existed in the early century because Rome was the only power. And then Rome was very strong in engineering, so that they had the same a lot of roadways and stuff that allowed it to go on. So I have a question, and it says, is that the same Paul who was on the Isle of Patmos? Well, I'm not sure Paul ended up on the Isle of Patmos, but John was the one who was imprisoned on the Isle of Patmos. Paul would have had a lot of seafaring journeys and would have used the sea to go all over the place. And some days he was imprisoned, and some days he was beaten, etc. Some days he was shipwrecked. So he may have certainly, in his many journeys, passed through the Aegean Sea and the Isle of Patmos. But Patmos was really a prison island, if you will, like how we use Carrera in Trinidad. And basically, the Romans placed John, the apostle there, and John is the one who is the author of Revelation in what we're doing. So I appreciate that question, and I trust that we've answered accordingly. So by 313, we have Constantine. So between here, if you will, between the rise of Christianity and the appearance of Constantine, the Roman emperor, the Jews are experiencing what I like to call sporadic persecution. It is not deliberate, it's not organized. In some areas, there are governors of Rome who don't like them. The Jews, of course, who like the Christians, and they're sometimes trying to separate themselves from them, etc. So there is some, I want us just to remember all of this detail, because when we get into understanding Revelation 13, we need to remember the historical context. So Constantine comes on the scene. He sees a symbol of a cross before he has one of his greatest victories, and he believes the Christians are supposed to be a blessing to the nation rather than a curse. So the political leader aligns himself with the religious Christians, if you will, and he blesses Christianity. He eventually declares it, if you will, as the official religion of Rome. So it is now called Roman Catholicism, meaning because it is universal. That's what Catholic means, and Roman means it started off in Rome, but it is really meant to serve all the world. So the church develops a whole new character, if you will. It is in unison and receiving the support of the state. And then we move to a point where the state has moved into a certain kind of situation where they are allowing, so Constantine is allowing a lot of beliefs to creep into the church because he is anxious to promote Christianity because he feels that he owes Christianity for his survival and for his sovereignty. But at the same time, he is conquering a lot of other nations. And as he brings some of these heathen nations into the kingdom of Rome, they come with a lot of practices. They come with a lot of beliefs in life after death. They come with practices that says that the sun is the most important thing in the universe, and they should observe the sun and have a day of worship to the sun, etc. They come with certain ritualistic approaches towards forgiveness, where they feel they must appease the gods, and so they practice a lot of different penances, etc. And slowly but surely, through a series of religious councils and coming together, what you find is that the beliefs of the nations that have been conquered now is the word I use when we're studying this in Daniel is syncretism. It is synchronized, if you will. It is brought into the church, and soon the church is now propagating, if you will, a series of beliefs and practices that are alien to the Bible and to the testaments and to the writings of the prophets and the apostles, but seems to find a lot of favor, if you will, with the people who are coming into the church. And Ellen White, he has a very important quote I like to use that says, the church increased in quantity, but decreased in quality. In other words, a lot more people came in, but the quality of the theology and the beliefs of the church took a nosedive, right? And then along the time that is happening, politically, other things are happening. Politically, the nations around Rome, particularly in the Mediterranean basin, are not happy with Romans' governance and leadership. And so they begin to attack, and they nip, and they find periods of wars and stuff. And if you look at a lot of the movies from that period in the Middle Ages, you begin to appreciate how much warring and stuff are taking place, all right? So soon you find that Western Rome is politically dead because the nations, indeed, almost 10 of those nations have taken prominent territories, and they are now in control, and they are leading things. So the Romans find themselves in a conundrum. To the east, in the area of Turkey, Constantinople, they are still powerful and they are still a mighty nation. But to the west, the empire is crumbling. And so by 538, if you will, Justinian, who is then the Roman emperor, long after Constantine has died, etc. Justinian is the one who says, listen, we cannot be two places at the same time, obviously. There's no internet, there's no travel and stuff. There's a whole different time. So what they did is to say, we will confer upon the head of the church in Rome, which was the only visible entity that seemed to represent Rome in a homogeneous way on the western side of the empire. And so as a result, we will confer upon the Bishop of Rome civil powers. We will give him political powers. We'll ask the legions and the remaining soldiers to report to him and conscript him, if you will, with powers that allows him to do certain things. And so by 538, there is a concretization of that approach to the point where the Bishop of Rome is seen, if you will, as a political and a religious head all in one. So while in Constantine era, you had a religious head and a political head, but the political head supported the church and they worked together. By 538, Western Rome had evolved, if you will, into a scenario where the head of the nation was also the head of the church, one and the same, which is an interesting construct. And that is where we start to have historians talking about the uniting of church and state and how significant that was. So that when the state made a decision, a lot of times it is influenced, if you will, by religious ideas and philosophies and thinking. And the Pope, the head of the church, he is making decisions not necessarily only for political advancement, but for spiritual advancement as well. And so there's a period, if you will, from 538 for the next 1,260 years, where the church enters the European period of history, enters into what is well known as the Dark Ages period. And you find that not only is the political ambitions of the nation of Rome advanced, but what also happens is that the few Christians, and we talked about the Waldenses, and we've talked about Huss, and we've talked about others, those Christians who want to remain faithful for what they know the scripture says, even though the scripture is not popular, there's no printing press, so it's not widely available, but there are few original copies that are kept and hidden in caverns and in dungeons, etc. So people have access to them, and they are well aware that what is being practiced is not aligned to what the church believes in terms of the scriptures. And as a result of that, these people become persecuted. They become the church in the wilderness. They are hiding, if you will, from the mainstream church. And you have a situation where you have the official church, and then you have the hidden church, if you will, and they are living in the shadows. They are living in the rocks and the mountains, all right? That is an important bit of history. Again, this is a historical fact. This is not only in the Bible, but is well covered historically. So this is the period known as the Dark Ages period. It is not only a bad period, however, because during that period, the Reformation takes force. And the very word says a lot, because it is about reforming the church. And so you have, in addition to Huss, you have people like Jerome, and then ultimately you have Martin Luther, who comes on the scene. And by 1517, he has created 95 theses, if you will, that says this church has gone away from the scriptures and you need to come back, all right? By 1798, the French Revolution has taken its full impetus. It has become a real force in world affairs. And to the extent that the French are now saying that there should be no monarchy, no system of one man ruling us. And we shouldn't allow the church to have such a heavy influence. And there's a huge change that is taking place there. And I told you that around that same time, you have this conversation by Voltaire and others around enlightenment and around whether or not there's a God. And you shouldn't even think about a God. And this Bible has kept us in dominance. And people start to talk about religion being the opium of the masses and that kind of thing, right? All those phrases occurred around that time. And with that impetus, if you will, the French Revolution effectively created a situation where the French officially overthrew the last elements of Rome, which was the Roman Church, and the Pope was captured in 1798 and died in prison a few years later. So clearly, the church seemed to have come to an end. The Roman Empire was certainly had come to an end. And the question is, did the Roman Empire die and the church die? Well, the fact of the matter is, today we know that the Roman Church is still very much alive and well. The head of the church is also considered to be a head of state. I told you that last week. He's the head of the Vatican. I told you as well that the head of the church is somebody who is listened to in the world today. So that clearly the church did not die in 1798. It may have been wounded. I use that word deliberately. But eventually the wound was healed. Again, I use that deliberately. And the church is now a permanent entity in world affairs today. All right? So one can argue that the wound was healed, if you will, by 1798. Moving a little bit from that, we also find that around this time, not too far after that, we had the great disappointment that occurred in 1844 that is linked to Daniel's prophecy of the 2300 days. It is the last time-based prophetic event given in the books of Daniel and Revelation, in terms of where very specific time was allotted. We had the 1,260 year period, which ended in 1798. And then we had the 2300 days prophecy, which is 2300 years that started in 457 BC and ended in 1844. That was the last time prophecy. And that is why when we looked at Revelation 10 and 11, the angel said, time shall be no more, because he was talking now about periods after this. All right. So that is important. I simply just put 2020 there to give you a sense on the timeline of the present day. And I am suggesting to you that the only thing now that is remaining to happen is for Christ to come a second time. Everybody okay with that? All right. So that is kind of where we are. And if I were to improve the number line to add in, if you will, the periods when the antediluvians, which is the people before the flood, the Egyptians and the Assyrians lived, that was maybe another 2,000 years or so. You have a sense that from a number line perspective, we are really living in the end of time. All right. If you think that you've heard this church story long time and stuff, we are living in a period which you can very well argue that the book of Revelation is covering, and it is a period just before Christ comes. Everybody okay with that overview? That was something that I keep doing over and over again, because I want you to appreciate that if you have this clear in your head, and don't worry about the dates, just have the sequence in your head. When we get to interpreting, we begin to understand where we are. Now, in that context, when we looked at the 7 churches, we found that while the messages to the 7 churches had applicability to their present day circumstances in John's time, while John is on the Isle of Patmos, he is the estranged pastor of these churches because he's now in prison. And it's not that the churches will love him, but he's estranged in the sense that he cannot be with them. So he is separated from them, if you will. And in that context, he sends messages to them that are written, that are specific, as it were, a pastor writing to a congregation and saying to them, look, you need to remember where you were when you were first coming to the church, or maybe in your area, certain things happen. So in each of these areas, Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamon, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, Laodicea, the messages were applicable to their very specific circumstance. But beyond that, the messages also have value because they represent periods in the history of the Christian church. And I just simply say the Christian church. I'm not trying to get into denominations now, but the Christian church. And in that context, we find that there's applicability. So for instance, during the period 31, which is after Christ died, around the 1st century, the end of the 1st century, the church really was on fire like how Ephesus was. But by after the 1st century, the church started to die down, if you will, after they had done through a lot, right? So we have here around the death of John, we have Smyrna, when the church went through a little bit of persecution and blood was flowing around the time of, and stopped when Constantine came into being. In Pergamon, you find that they are forced to worship false idols, etc. And that happens and comes into being. And so that seems to tie into the period between Constantine and eventually when Justinian gives power to the church in a big way, and people were being forced to, a lot of impure doctrines were coming in. But by the Thyatira era, we are in a period here, if you will, where the church is now the dominant political force, but they are persecuting those who are not supportive of them, and they are also amplifying and cementing and reinforcing some of the wrong truths that they had developed along the way. All right, that continues, if you will, in the Sardis period, and then after the Pope was in prison, and you had this relief that hit the Christian world after the French Revolution had taken its root. You had the French who were pushing, if you will, and together with those who believe in the Enlightenment, a secular kind of world that there is no God, no need to follow religion, etc. And that still prevails today. But there was also an outburst of Christianity, brotherly love, a Philadelphia period where the church just grew. There were Baptists and Methodists and other people who were really pushing the gospel. The printing press had come in, people preparing tracts, etc. The Adventist movement started around that time. And so we came to the 1844 period. And then we are saying post-1844, as we move towards the end of time, we're in a Laodicean period where sometimes people seem to be lukewarm and not on fire for Christianity. That is something to just keep in your mind, because I think it has importance to what we're doing today, right? But when we got to Revelation chapter 12, it was clear, right? It says in Revelation chapter 12, that was where we had the vision of the dragon after the woman who was with child, who was pregnant with her child. And then he went after the woman herself and she fled into the wilderness. If you remember all that history I just gave you, then let's see if we can make some correlations. So clearly, verses 1 to 6 of Revelation chapter 12 talks about the woman about to give birth to a man-child who will rule with the rod of iron. And we talked about that being the fact that Christ was supposed to be the one who will rule the earth and the universe as the Heavenly Father's son who had come upon the earth to represent him, if you will. But the devil tried to kill him. And the devil tried to kill him through the Roman soldiers who tried to kill him through Herod and his decree. And then ultimately by dying and putting him on the cross of Calvary, right? So that the Romans were the ones who had done that. At that time, the Romans are a vicarious representation of the dragon. What do I mean by that? The dragon himself, Lucifer himself, is not lifting his hand to put the nails on Jesus in the cross. The Romans are doing it, but they are doing it on his behalf. Now, that's really important, because that helps us to understand the relationship between the dragon and entities that work with the dragon. And that's not unique to the dragon. So that, for instance, Isaiah talks a lot about the fact that God persecuted Israel. But who really persecuted Israel was the Assyrians. Who really captured Israel and carried them into captivity? It was the Babylonians. So one could very well conclude, as indeed we have, and a lot of theologians will tell you that is common expectation, that God used the Assyrians in some instances, and he used the Babylonians sometimes and others to persecute Israel and to bring them into alignment when they went away from him. So at that point in time, Israel, Assyria, and Babylon are acting on God's behalf. So they are agents of God. And that is an important little truth. I'm suggesting to you that when the Romans attempted to kill baby Jesus and then eventually kill the man Jesus by putting upon the cross, they were acting on behalf of the dragon. They are basically emissaries and servants of the dragon. They are substitutory on behalf of the dragon. So they are the dragon's vicarious servants, if you will. They are his proxies. Through them, he's executing what he's done. So the dragon, Lucifer, is attempting to kill Christ in his mission to save mankind, but he fails. And in failing, Christ dies upon the cross. He declares it is finished. And we came to the understanding that when Jesus said it was finished, what he really is saying is that you have lost Satan and I have won. All right? And as a result, he went back up into heaven, which is also picked up in Revelation chapter 12, verse 6. And the devil now, we get to the second section, he's expelled from heaven. Now you will say to me that the expulsion of the devil from heaven occurred way before earth was started, right? And Adam and Eve. Because in truth and in fact, Lucifer's rebellion in heaven, which I told you is a mystery of heaven, we don't know how that started, occurred a long time ago. And at that time, he was expelled. But he was expelled onto earth where God will eventually set up the Garden of Eden. But Lucifer had the privilege, my word, to go back and forth into the heavenly courts. And I use that word carefully, right? So it doesn't necessarily mean that he is in heaven, but he's certainly in the heavenly realm. And we know that from reading the first and second chapter of the book of Job, where Lucifer comes to represent earth. What we are also saying, though, and I want you to be very clear about this conclusion, is that if you look at, and there's two texts I just want to use here quickly. There's one that in John chapter 12, verses 30 to 31, Jesus answered and said, this voice came. So Jesus is talking to his disciples, and then they hear a voice like thunder from God declaring him to be the one who will die for them, right? So Jesus answered and said to them, this voice that came not because of me, but for your sake. In other words, God is making that pronouncement about who he is, not for Jesus to say, because Jesus had already come to realization that he's the Son of God, but for the disciples. Then he says, now is the judgment of this world. Now shall the prince of this world be cast out. So Jesus is saying, because he was, and I didn't put all the verses here. That's your homework to go back and read John chapter 12 carefully. But when you look at it, Jesus is given an indication that he will be crucified. And then they hear the voice of God. So he's saying to the disciples that this crucifixion represents the judgment of this world. Who is in charge of this world? Lucifer. Because up until that point, Lucifer is going back and forth, representing earth in the heavenly realm. So Jesus is then saying that when this judgment of the world is finished, and on the cross he cried, it is finished, then shall the prince of the world be cast out. So there is a second cast out of Lucifer, where he cannot even go into the heavenly realm. And I mean, I am inferring that from these texts, but there are other authors. Ellen White, for instance, talks about this extensively, and she says that given the significance and the severity and the ghastliness of the cross of Calvary, the whole of heaven really saw how deadly Lucifer was, and he lost his opportunity to go and dwell upon the heavenly courts. All right? And then in Luke chapter 10, verses 17 to 20, Jesus has just given the disciples the power to go out into the field and become disciples and really cast out devils and preach to people. So they went out, and then they came back, and they said to return with joy and said, Lord, even I put in New International Version here so we can better understand it. They came back and with a lot of pride in their faces. And I always say to you, you got to be careful that we do not replace the pride of the world with the pride of the church, because sometimes we can feel too proud of ourselves as Christians. He says, Lord, even the demons submit to us in your name. And he replied, almost as if they're saying that, he said, I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven. Now, of course, he's referring to the fact that Satan fell from heaven as a result of his pride and his wanted to be like God. And he says, I have given you authority to trample on snakes and scorpions and to overcome all the power of the enemy. In other words, God is saying, I've given you all the power. Nothing will harm you. However, do not rejoice that his spirit submit to you, but rejoice that your names are written in heaven. In other words, God is saying to them, don't get caught up in your acts and the things you have done, but get caught up in the fact that you are saved by Jesus Christ, right? But the important point I want to make here is that he saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven, which is similar to the language that is used in the expulsion of Satan from the heavenly host. So I'm saying to you that Satan was initially expelled from heaven at the time of his rebellion and his revolution, but in the subsequent periods of history, he seemed to have the ability to still appear before the heavenly realm and to have conversations with God, etc., right? Because God is not about destroying him deliberately and exactly at the beginning. And again, Ellen White has a powerful chapter on that in Why Is Sin Permitted in the book Patriots and Prophets. It's about the very first chapter in the book. And there's a powerful chapter in there about God's difficulty with destroying Satan immediately if there was already an accusation that he was not a loving God, etc., right? But once Christ had died upon the cross, Lucifer's access to the heavenly realm and the heavenly throne is now cut off. And that is what we are reading in the second part of Revelation. So if you think about it, the dragon, Lucifer, goes after Jesus Christ when he comes upon the earth. He fails. Christ goes back up into heaven. And he has lost his access to the heavenly throne because he's now very much aware that he has lost the cosmic controversy. And the only thing that now remains is for him to be put to death. So what does he do? Well, the third part tells us that given the fact that he has lost out on the child that the woman was bearing, he now goes after the woman, and the woman is the church both in the Old Testament and the New Testament. And in this case, given the fact that Christ died in the New Testament period, he goes after the New Testament church, and the New Testament church runs into the wilderness and hide, which is why I spent so much time talking to you about the Dark Ages period and the true believers going into dungeons and tunnels and wildernesses and caves, etc., in our way to hide from the official church that is trying to destroy them. And then we are also told that as we get post 1798, that is the inference of the language that is used in Revelation chapters 12, verses 13 to 17, that he is not only now mad because he is not able to destroy the woman, because she goes into the wilderness and she's fed by God and she is placed in there by God, right? So God takes care of her. And then what then happens is that the verse 17 then goes on to tell us that he is no longer just mad with a woman, because it says at the end of the 1260 years, Revelation predicted the rise of God's last day church, right? And it reveals the characteristic of the reverend. So what does it say? They say the dragon now was wrought with a woman and went to make war with a remnant of her seed. Why is he going after the remnant? Because he went after the woman herself, which is the church, and the church went into the wilderness, into the Dark Ages period, and emerged after 1798 as still being the true church. So God preserved the Bible. People like Tyndale and others were translating the Bible into different languages. During the Dark Ages period, it wasn't only in Latin. So there was an explosion of Christianity after 1798. And people started to preach and talk about the message. It is that explosion and study of the word that led them to believe Christ was coming in 1844. All right. So what we're beginning to appreciate is that Revelation chapter 12 is telling us that in this end time period where there's this explosion of Christianity, the dragon, having not succeeded with a woman, he makes his final play, and his final play will be for God's last day church, the remnant seed of the woman. The remnant seed of the woman is the church towards the end of time that is moving and around just before Christ comes, right? This church is characterized as one that keep the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus, right? And I went on to tell you, well, you don't have to guess what keeping the commandments means. It means keeping all of God's commandments, including the fourth one that says, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy, right? So that is a characteristic of God's last day church, the seed of the woman, the remnant, if you will. And then it must have the testimony of Jesus. That one is a little bit of a tricky idiomatic expression. We're not too sure what it means, but it reoccurs in Revelation 19:10. And in that he says, as he concluded, he says, for the testimony of Jesus is the spirit of prophecy. So it's almost as if it's suggesting that God's last day church will not only keep the commandments, but will have a prophetic gift. And we went through that at a length last week, and I told you in every era of the church, there was a prophetic gift. It was a way of advancing the work of the church. And so when we look at how the church progressed, and we talked about those who were pushing the Bible, and then Luther and Huss and Calvin, etc., and the Anabaptists and stuff, Wesley, who started the Methodist Church. When we get to the church after 1844, after 1798, if you will, it is the Advent movement who is pushing Sabbath keeping, the true beliefs about life after death, pushing a health message. And they are also enamored. They are also blessed. They are also benefiting from the gift of prophecy through the writings of Ellen White, which gives the church a prophetic gift. All right. So those are some key identifying marks of the church. Now, there's an important point I want to make with you today, which I don't think I've done before. And I wanted to look at Malachi chapter 4, verse 5 and 6. And it says, behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord. And he shall turn the heart of the fathers to the children, and the heart of the children to their fathers, lest I come and smite the earth with a curse. The great and dreadful day of the Lord seemed to suggest just before Christ comes. Everybody okay with that? That's a reasonable expectation. Or a lot of times when Christians, not just Seventh-day Adventists, when Christians read this text, they make the conclusion that this is referring to John the Baptist. And then to some extent it is, because John the Baptist was seen as a second Elijah. He was the one who came and proclaimed Jesus's comings and the fact that he would be the one who would take away the sin of the world, etc. And John the Baptist was seen as a second Elijah, or Elias as he was called. But the fact is, this text seems to be making a bigger pitch, if you will, and is speaking towards the end time. So I begin to ask myself, should I spend more time studying the prophecies of Elijah? Oh, there's a video I found on YouTube, but there are many others, and I was going to play it now, but I won't. I just want to talk about Elijah a little bit. See, it starts to play, but let's not play it yet, right? We will come back to that. I want to talk about Elijah a little bit. Quickly. First of all, Elijah was a prophet in Old Testament times who was basically representing God at a time when Israel, the nation of Israel, was in apostasy. The king of Israel was a fellow called Ahab. Ahab would have been one of those distant kings since the days of Solomon. Ahab had a wife called Jezebel, who was a Canaanite. So she was coming from because the northern tribes of Israel had found a way to inculcate a lot of the heathen nations around them, including the Canaanites and the Samaritans, etc. And they had begun to practice Judaism, even though they were not traditional Jews. And maybe that's why we have so many different people could claim Jewish heritage all over the world, right? So in this period, the king, the political ruler, is influenced by Jezebel, who is his wife, who is a high priestess from her Canaanite origins, and who is practicing a form of religion that resembles Judaism, right? But they have corrupted the Jewish, and I've given you the synopsis. You could go back and read 1 Kings from about 16 all the way to 19, right? Chapter 16 to 19. And get the full story, or watch one of the videos on YouTube. But the fact is that Israel under Ahab's rule have become a corrupted Jewish nation. They have taken down the altars for God and the way God had asked them to serve, and they were offering sacrifices, in particular to one god, a fellow called Baal. Baal was a Canaanite god, who was considered to be the most powerful god of the Canaanites. And interestingly, he was a god of the sun, who they valued the sun as Baal had the power over the sun, right? So having said that, stay with me. There's a reason I want to go through this, because I want to go back to that Micah text, if you will. And I want you to appreciate this end time requirement for us. So because I think that the Elijah of old and the remnant seed are very much aligned, and the situations that are occurring, we will see parallels between them. So God tells Elijah, go to Ahab, the king, and tell him that his evil and the wrong things he is doing, God doesn't like it, and that more importantly, there will be a drought in the land for about 3.5 years. All right? So Elijah goes and he tells him that, and Jezebel is really upset. And she wants to kill Elijah. So get the scenario here. Elijah has indicated that the nation is going to go through a period of drought, climate change. I said that deliberately, climate change. And as they go through this period of climate change, they will do all they can to try to survive. But eventually, Jezebel will influence the king. So the religious lady who is corrupt is influencing the political leader who is Ahab, her husband, because they are united. Church and state is united. And she tells him to kill and destroy the man of God who brought the message about the fact that their evil is going to lead to climate change and the drama within the community. So they blame the climate change as occurring in the drought on Elijah, and they attempt to destroy Elijah. Eventually, this culminates into a battle on Mount Carmel. Elijah, 1 Kings chapter 18. Powerful message. 450 prophets of Baal assemble on Mount Carmel. They build an altar and they agree with Elijah because they now need to prove who is the real God. And they agree with Elijah that they will rest a sacrifice on the top of the altar, and they will both pray. And the God who consumes the sacrifice with fire is the true God. So the prophets of Baal went into their prayer and their summoning of their God, and they danced around the sacrifice and thing for a long time, to the point where there's an interesting chapter. There's some humor in there. Elijah says to them, maybe your God is asleep. He's having an afternoon rest. You could go back and read that. That's interesting. It's a little bit of humor in the Bible. And eventually they give up. And what was Elijah's turn? The first thing Elijah did was to reestablish the altar of God at 12 stones. Then he prayed to God and he said, dear God, let them see, my words, let them see that you are the true God. And the fire came down from heaven and consumed the sacrifice of Elijah to show that his God was the true God. And all the prophets of Baal were destroyed. They were put into, they were cast into a dungeon, they were put to death. And Jezebel didn't like that. She tried to kill Elijah again and threatened to kill him. And he ran into a wilderness. And he spent a long time in the wilderness. And when he was in the wilderness, hiding in a cave, and he thought he was lost, God came and fed him with ravens, gave him food. So while he's in the wilderness, God took care of him. Think about that. He's in the wilderness, and God takes care of him. The woman goes into the wilderness, the church, and God takes care of her. And then when he thinks he's alone, and he's about to get into a period of despair and desperation, God passes and he says, what are you doing here, Elijah? One of my favorite texts. What doest thou here? And he said, I alone am serving you. And God said, no, that's not true. There is a remnant of Israel for about 7,000 who have also not bowed their heads and their knees to Baal, and they are serving me. So that when Elijah thought he was alone, there was a remnant with him. All right, so I want to keep that in your mind. My big points are that Jezebel, who was an impure religious priestess, was in a union with a political leader, Ahab, husband and wife. She influenced Ahab and his decisions. They experienced a period of drastic climate change to the point where they're not too sure what to do. So they blamed the man of God, and he thought he was alone, but there were at least others with him, remnants who were with him. So they were under the threat as well. But to prove the God of heavens, fire came down from heaven to prove who God was. And everybody else realized that God is the God of the universe, right? That's an important little bit just to keep in your mind. So I want to keep that in your mind as background. We will come back to that in a little bit. So let's go to Revelation chapter 13. We said that there are three major sections. I'm moving along faster now because all that background I give you is to help you better. You see, Revelation 13 has a lot in it, and I want you to, we are making some powerful conclusions in Revelation chapter 13. And for you to appreciate those conclusions, you must appreciate the historical context. You must say, Fitzroy is not a madman. He didn't just come and pull this out of his head. There's a value for that, right? So we are encountering three beasts in Revelation chapter 13. One could argue it's really two, but I want to say it's three. We did the sea beast last week, and we come back to that quickly. And then we're talking about a beast from the earth, which we're starting today. And then we are talking about an image of the beast, which is where the 666 comes in. And I know some of you are anxious to get that. But if we don't understand the context, we'll never understand the value of that as we go forward, right? So when we did the beast of the sea last week, we wanted to know who is this beast that he saw that looked like a leopard, bear, lion, had 7 heads, it had 10 horns with crowns upon the heads, signifying something around nations here, etc. And one of the heads had a wound, etc. Right? And we said that this song familiar because it is aligned to what Daniel saw, and therefore this beast and the ones from Daniel most likely are one and the same. So when we looked at his identity, we simply followed what the scripture says, right? It says it came out of the sand of the sea. It came out on the sand, sorry, of the sea. So it came out of the sea, and I told you that in prophecy, Revelation 17 tells us many waters represent many peoples, and then there's another verse in Ezekiel as well, so that when we talk about a place where the sea is where there are people, and I told you that when we talked about Nebuchadnezzar, and we talked about Babylon and Media Persia, etc., it was a place in the Mesopotamian valley, and between Tigris and Euphrates, etc., there were many people. And so we would be thinking here that this beast represents a nation that is coming out of that area, right? And we know that the beast that came out of that area, similarly represented by heads and stuff in Daniel, would have been Babylon, Media Persia, Greece, and then Rome. And Rome was the one that had 10 heads and horns, and it had a little horn that grew up and that kind of thing, right? So it had 7 heads, 10 horns. And on the horns, 10 crowns, and on his head was a blasphemous name. Once you start to see blasphemous name, you remember Daniel chapter 7, where he talks about the little horn that spoke blasphemy against God. And that was then talking about religious Rome that became a political power, right? He talked about what it looked like. And then on the last part here, he said the dragon gave him his power, his throne, and his great authority. Now we know that the sequence of events from that period is very simple. We had Babylon, we had Media Persia, we had Greece, then we had Rome in its civil incarnation, or its political incarnation, but it was soon followed by religious political Rome. I told you that when we discussed it earlier. That is why I went through that long review with you. So that when we talk about the fact that the dragon gave it its seat, its power, and its authority, we are saying that civil Rome gave religious political Rome its seat, its power, and authority. But in truth and in fact, civil Rome is acting vicariously a representative of, it is a proxy for the dragon, which is Lucifer in heaven. Everybody okay with that? So basically we are saying that this beast that emerges out of the sea is really acting on behalf of the dragon. And this slide comes straight out of our review of Daniel when we did that last year. And we had then made a powerful conclusion that religious political Rome is the little horn of the 4th beast. And I argue with you now that it is also the beast that appeared out of the sea. So they are one and the same, all right? It is a mix of the 4 beasts of Daniel, so that while Daniel had lion, bear, leopard, and a beast with 10 horns, in Revelation we find a beast with 10 horns, and then we are later told he appeared to look like a leopard, a bear, and a lion, all right? So Daniel lived in the period of the lion. John is living in the period of the 4th beast, which is Rome, all right? So the beast of the sea is the Roman church, the Roman Catholic Church, particularly during that Dark Ages period, right? And that is what we recognize, that its activities were around the period of the Dark Ages. Because when we went to verses 3 to 4, we talked about people worshiping the dragon, which gave power unto the beast, and they worship the beast, saying, who is like unto the beast? And we talk about the fact that this language is important, because this language is reminding us of Michael, the archangel. And it's almost as if this beast is comparing itself to Michael, which is Jesus Christ, all right? He spoke great things, blasphemies. We've seen that before. Blasphemies against God, and he make war unto the saints and to overcome them. And he was given to them, for instance, for a time, right? And then we are told that all who dwell upon the earth will worship him. This seems to be more futuristic, because that wasn't necessarily happening in the Old Testament, in the Dark Ages period, but we'll come to that. Whose names have not been written in the book of life and slain from the foundation of the world. And then he gave us the final thing about, but you know, there's a caution. He's cautioning, God is cautioning Rome to say, there is a prediction, yes, but understand that if you're going to captivity and capturing people, you too will be captive. And then finally he concludes by saying, we must have faith and patience as the saints of God, right? So clearly, the activities of the sea beast that is important here were the activities related to the Dark Ages period. Everybody okay with that? In case you feel that fly fast, we did some conclusions last week that I want to just review again, right? We said the beast represents an earthly kingdom that was represented in Daniel, one and the same, right? Rising from the sea implies that the kingdom that arose was from a populous place, which was Europe or Mesopotamia, however you wish to call it. Compared to Daniel 7, this beast is the Roman nation. The dragon, giving the beast its power, its seat, and its authority, refers to religious political Rome from 538 AD. I wonder why I spent so much time in the beginning going over that, because it applies now, right? And then the reference to 42-month period is the same as 1,260 years, and therefore it was from 538 AD to 1790. So clearly, this is about religious political Rome that is being described here. So we are saying that religious political Rome during the Dark Ages period acted on behalf of civil Rome, who in turn was acting on behalf of the dragon, which means that religious political Rome was acting on behalf of Lucifer and carrying out the desires and the wishes of Lucifer. What were the desires and wishes of Lucifer? It was to destroy the church, having failed to destroy the child of the woman, which is Jesus Christ. So that is what, when religious political Rome is throwing people into dungeons, having them burned to the stake and eaten by lions, etc., it may seem to be conceived and concocted within their own minds, but we have to be very conscious of the fact that it may very well be that they are proxies of Lucifer and they are carrying that. Does that mean that they are given a blight? Of course not. They are still going to be held accountable for their own actions. But the fact of the matter is that their actions are moved by Lucifer. I want to say to you today, there's a powerful truth, a powerful conclusion, and it must also remind us that while the devil can move and have proxies, my obligation as a Christian was that I must be a proxy of Jesus Christ. If anybody must move me, it must be God. That's why Paul said, let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus. In other words, what Christ would have done, we would do, because Jesus is the one who motivates and guides us. And we will hope that Jesus could also guide the nations, but nations sometimes are moved and are manipulated by either God or Satan, and it depends on the situation and the time. In this circumstance, we are saying that the religious political Rome was guided and directed, if you will, by Lucifer himself. We know that the wound that was given to the church in 1798 will eventually heal. It will heal before Christ comes, and the Roman church will be strong again. Again, fait accompli. You know that even today, that the church is strong even now, right? The reference to the whole world marveling after the beast implies that the beast will regain a prominent position and standing in world affairs. So that is to come, and two classes of worshippers will emerge. So we are saying that we are expecting. So this is now when I said to you earlier that we must make reasonable conclusions about the future. This is one of them. We are saying that that reference to the whole world, Revelation chapter 12, I think it was verse 15, the whole world marveling after the beast, that is something to come, all right? But it is suggesting that two classes of worshippers will emerge. Those who worship God or Christ, because their names are written in the Lamb Book of Life, and the life of the Lamb is always Jesus Christ. He's the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the earth. And then those who worship the heel beast, who continues to be an agent of the dragon. The whole world marvel after him. Everybody understanding that? So there is a controversy that is emerging that suggests that as we move towards the end of time, there will be a question of who is worthy of worship and who should you worship. And the question is, when you are a religious person, I'm not just saying Christian, when you're a religious person, who gets your worship? Who deserves your worship? Is it God or is it something else? And we need to be very, very careful of that, because from what we are reading is that if this is religious political Rome, you would find that those who worshipped in religious political Rome time would very well be worshiping within a church context. But in worshiping in a church context, they were worshiping Lucifer, right? And the dragon, all right? And then he was reminded that if they persecute and kill, they will be killed. But the living saints, those of us who are remaining faithful to God, we encourage to keep the faith and don't give up, right? So now I come to, some would argue this should have been my main presentation from the beginning, but let's talk about that, right? So a second beast emerges, right? And you notice that there is a very deliberate comparative structure that is used here in the narrative, because while the first beast emerges from the sand, onto the sand from the sea, so it emerges from the sea, the second beast is emerging from a land area. We need to understand what that means, right? So we talked about the three major sections, and we have a beast in Revelation 13, 11 to 13, and then that is coming from the earth, and we want to talk about that, and we talk about the image of the beast, which is the last thing, right? So what does verse 11 say? He says, let's cut it. He says, I beheld another beast coming out of the earth. This is very deliberate language, and we'll come back to those words coming out, etc., because they have powerful meaning. This beast had 2 horns, no 10 horns, no old-time thing where it had 10 horns. So clearly there's a different beast from the Roman era where you had, because the 10 horns in Rome always reminds us about the 10 nations that Rome conquered to become powerful. This one is different. It says it had 10 horns like a lamb. So the beast is looking like a lamb. But then it says, and there's an and that and seems to suggest, and sometime after, not at the same time, or maybe at the same time, I don't know. It says, and he spake as a dragon. So here we are seeing a beast that looks like a lamb. And once you hear lamb, you think of Jesus. So you begin to think of, maybe this is talking about a nation, because we know that the word beast in these prophecies are synonymous or representative metaphorically of a nation. So he is saying that he beheld, while he beheld the sea beast, which is Roman religious political Rome, it seems to be this and is almost to say, and after that, after seeing that beast, I then see. So there's another nation or another kingdom that emerges. It is coming out. That word coming out means springing up. It almost means as if it is a plant that is growing out of the earth. So it is growing out of the earth. If the sea area is an area of plenty people, then an earth area is an area where there's not a lot of people. It's sparsely populated, not a lot, right? So we need to remember that. These are some of the clues. And that because the nation has a character, it had 2 horns like a lamb. Don't stop at the 2 horns. Go on to the part that says like a lamb. So the nation takes on a lamb-like countenance. It must be a nation, therefore, that is very much steeped in Jesus Christ and the things of Jesus Christ, you would think. But then he counters that by saying, and just when we were becoming hopeful, that it also spoke as a dragon. So we have to be wary of that, right? And it doesn't just stop there. So we're talking identity and activities. It says he exercised all the power of the first beast. This is powerful. So it is suggesting that the second beast will exercise the power of the first beast, which is a religious political Rome. So even though it is a different nation, it may exercise the same power and authority of the previous nation. Now, that is a different construct to where it says the dragon gave him its seat, its power, and its authority. This one is different. This one is saying he will maintain his uniqueness of being a lamb that speaks like a dragon. But in doing that, he will exercise power as the beast that went before him, right? And then he says, and caused the earth and them that dwell therein to worship the first beast, whose deadly wound was healed. So this is now time dating it. It is saying that this exercise of power doesn't happen around 1798, because 1798 is when the wound is inflicted upon the Roman Church, the Roman Catholic Church. The Pope is put into grave and put into prison, and he dies. So it is suggesting, these are powerful, simple words that even before we get into any supporting slides, we are making very clear conclusions about the future. So it's saying that this nation that will arise after 1798, or around that time, if you will, sometime after the first beast arrives, because the beast that comes out of the sea is really coming out of the sea around 538 AD. So sometime after that, another beast will arise. It will have very loving, lamb-like persona, an outward nature, if you will. But until it speaks, when it starts to speak, it speaks as a dragon, all right? So that is, he's specific about that. He says in appearance, it looks like a lamb. It has two horns as a lamb, and it looks lamb-like. Meaning it looks Christ-like, because I'm making that inference. But when it speaks, it's something completely different, right? And you begin to appreciate that this beast is maybe a little bit more dragonish than it looks, all right? You know, Christ talks about in Matthew 24:25, he says, beware of wolves in sheep's clothing, which will come to deceive you in the last days, right? So he seemed to be making a reference to this. But then when we get to verse 12, it says he will exercise the power of the first beast. So that's important because Jezebel, if I could use that, if I could go back here, one day when I told you all about Elijah, Jezebel had the power of Ahab's throne, even though she was not the political power, right? So I want to suggest to you that it seemed to suggest, or you could look at it the other way around. You could argue that Ahab exercised Jezebel's power, even though she was the high priestess from Canaan, and he was the political power. He carried out Jezebel's wishes. Is that okay? So here you have a situation where another nation is coming up. This nation looks like a lamb in its countenance and its whole demeanor and its whole, your first impressions are such a lovely animal, if you will, a lovely kingdom, a nice place. But when it speaks as a dragon. It seems to be very autocratic. It speaks almost dragonish, if you will, my word, in the way it speaks. And then it will exercise the power of the first beast. So it begins to exercise the power. The first beast had power to control what people believe, how they worship, etc., and put them into dungeons and stuff. So this power seems that we get to that point where it will do that. And it will do it around the time when the wound is healed. So it is a long time after 1798 when the Roman church is back in its full prominence. So that, I suspect, is something to look forward to, unless you can find an example of where that happened already. I think it is something to look forward to. And then he says, you're beginning to understand now why I gave you that Elijah story. You thought I was making up space to try to just cover things. It says, and he doeth great wonders, so that he maketh fire come down from earth, from heaven, on the earth, in the sight of men. When did we see that phrase before? Well, I told you that for Elijah to convince the people of Israel and the false prophets that he was really a representative of God, he called upon God to bring fire from heaven to ignite his sacrifice. And when that happened, that was the definitive illustration, manifestation that Elijah served Yahweh, Jehovah, the powerful God. Everybody okay with that? So that whole experience is very much steeped in the minds of Jews, that when God wants to tell you who he is, he brings down fire from heaven to earth. What this text is telling us, if you go back to 12, is that he talking about is the second beast. And it seems to suggest that in addition to reflecting the power of the first beast, the second beast will perform a miracle or miracles where he will bring down fire from heaven onto earth. But we just discussed that this second beast is exercising the power of the first beast. So this second beast, this lamb-like beast that is coming out from the earth and speaking like a dragon, he clearly is not a representative of the God of heaven, but he is carrying on activities. He is allowing for manifestations of power, almost as if it is God who has come. And that is extremely powerful. And when we come back next week, we'll talk about a text in Thessalonians that Paul uses that says, when Christ comes a second time, it would be as fire from heaven, my words. Almost to suggest without us going any further, I'm just leaving food for thought, that this second beast will seem to mimic the second coming of Jesus Christ. We get into some really deep stuff here, and we need to really, really pay attention to it. Who is the second beast? We will start that next week. But let me just leave you with some mouth-watering appetizers. It will arise at the correct time. Know that it will arise at the correct time. It will arise in the correct place. I'm just giving you those. So we need to go back and think about that. I want that to stay with you. I want us to conclude now, because we now have a point to come back on, by just having a moment of reflection. It says, this is what Ellen White says in Great Controversy. I forgot to put the page on it. It says the message will be carried not so much by the argument as by the deep conviction of the Holy Spirit. You know what message is this? It's the message of the gospel and of Jesus Christ. A lot of us think we need to argue about how right our religion is. But I want you to know that we sow the seed, and God is the one who grows the plant. He does the germination. So she's saying that the message will be carried not so much by argument. A lot of us as preachers, we go up on the pulpit and we argue against what other religions are doing. But I sometimes feel we need to present Christ and God more, because there is power in the word of God, right? The arguments have been presented. The seed has been sown. And now it will spring up and bear fruit. That is from the Holy Spirit, right? The publications distributed by missionary workers have exerted their influence. Some people are converted by tracts and books they read long after they are published. Yet many whose minds were impressed have been prevented from fully comprehending the truth or from yielding obedience. Because there's a battle going on, right? Now the rays of light, she's talking more around the end of time as we begin to study God's word in fullness. The rays of light penetrate everywhere, and truth is seen in its clearness. That is my mission when we go through these lessons, that you understand the truth in the scriptures. And the honest children of God sever the bands which have held them. And that don't have to do with church and religion, because the honest children of God are all over the world. Family connections. You know, some people say, I can't leave my church because that's where my family was and all that kind of thing, or this is what we believe since we're small. Church relations are powerless to stay them now. Truth is more precious. That is why I put that on top. Truth is more precious than all besides. Notwithstanding the agencies combine against the truth, a large number take their stand upon the Lord's side. So next week, we will focus on the activities of the second beast, but I will go back a bit and talk about the nature of the second beast, because I haven't given you my conclusion as to who this beast is. That is your homework. And if you do any reading, you will arrive at that your own selves. But I want you to have an moment. You know, you must see it. But clearly we are seeing some powerful truths emerging here, and we need to pay attention to that as we go forward. Any questions as we come to a close? Everybody okay? I know I left you hanging a little bit, but that's fine. You will continue next week. I won't do as much revision, but I thought it was important today to just put some context around all that we've been studying, so that at least we appreciate where we are heading so far. All right, so if there are no questions, let's bow our heads a prayer and we join again next week. Heavenly Father, we thank you, Lord, for your word. And we thank you for such powerful truths that are embedded in your word that excites us when we discover them. We are excited because we know that you have a plan, that you are in charge of our lives, and that you are really heading to tell us something about the future. Not so that we could predict it, or that we could go around saying we know what will happen, but that we can prepare ourselves to be ready. You have said in your word in the book of John, chapter 14, that you have told us what will come to pass, so that we will be ready for when you come a second time. Move upon us in our mark way and draw us ever closer to you. It's our prayer in Jesus' most holy name. Amen.